Hello, and thank you for being here with me today. Before this story truly begins, I want you to think about something simple. Think about the people who have passed through your life, not the ones who stayed for years or played obvious roles, but the ones who appeared quietly, almost briefly, and then disappeared. They may not have known your story, and you may not have known theirs. There were no long conversations, no promises, no clear connections that seemed important at the time, and yet somehow they stayed with you. If you pause for a moment and reflect, you may begin to realize something surprising: how many of them changed you without even knowing it. My name is Henry, and when I look back on my life, I can clearly see certain moments that shaped me in ways I did not understand at the time. These moments did not feel important when they happened. They did not stand out or demand attention. In fact, many of them passed so quietly that I almost forgot them until much later, when I began to recognize how deeply they had influenced the person I was becoming. They were not dramatic turning points. There were no grand gestures, no powerful speeches, no unforgettable events that marked them as significant. There were no moments where everything suddenly made sense, no clear signal that something important had just occurred. Instead, they were quiet moments, small interactions, simple acts of humanity, moments that could easily have been forgotten, but somehow were not, because sometimes it is the quietest people who leave the deepest marks on our lives. I did not always understand this. For a long time, I believed that change came from big events, from success, from failure, from decisions that felt important and visible. I thought that if something was going to shape my life, it had to be obvious. It had to be something I could recognize immediately, something I could point to and say, "That is the moment everything changed." I believed that transformation required effort, intention, and awareness, that it was something we chose, something we worked toward, something we could control if we tried hard enough. But life has a way of teaching us something different. Sometimes, the moments that shape us most are the ones that arrive quietly, without asking for attention. They do not interrupt our lives. They blend into them, and because of that, we often fail to recognize their importance until much later. When we look back and begin to connect the invisible threads, I remember one such moment clearly, even though at the time it felt like nothing at all. I was walking home after a long day, lost in my own thoughts, carrying worries that felt heavier than they probably were. As I walked, I passed by an older man sitting quietly on a bench, watching the world move around him. As I passed, he looked up briefly and gave me a small, almost unnoticeable smile. That was all. There were no words, no conversation, just a simple human acknowledgement. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but later that evening, I realized something inside me had shifted. That small moment had interrupted the noise in my mind. It had reminded me, even if only for a second, that I was not as alone in the world as I sometimes felt. Another time, I found myself in a short conversation with someone I barely knew. We spoke only for a few minutes about something ordinary, something that would normally be forgotten as soon as it ended. But in the middle of that conversation, they said something simple, something they probably did not think twice about. "You don't always have to have everything figured out." The sentence stayed with me, not because it was complex, but because it arrived at a moment when I needed to hear it. At that time, I had been carrying a quiet pressure to understand my life completely, to know exactly where I was going, what I was doing, and who I was becoming. That one sentence did not solve anything, but it softened something inside me. It permitted me, even if only for a moment, to release that pressure. And that is how these moments work. They do not always change your life in obvious ways. Instead, they change how you feel about your life. They shift something small inside you. And sometimes that small shift is enough to begin a much larger transformation over time. There were many moments like this scattered throughout my life. A teacher who once paused during a lesson and told me to take my time, reminding me that I was doing better than I thought. A stranger who held the door open just a little longer than necessary. A friend who listened without interrupting, without trying to fix anything, simply allowing silence to exist. None of these moments was extraordinary on its own, but together they formed something meaningful. They reminded me that the world is not only shaped by big events, but also by small ones, by quiet kindness, by unnoticed understanding, by the simple act of being present with another person. Over time, I began to understand something I had never considered before. We are constantly influencing each other, not only through what we intentionally say or do, but through the small, unconscious ways we show up in each other's lives. A tone of voice, a gesture, a moment of patience, a sentence spoken without realizing its impact. All of these things carry weight, and all of them have the potential to stay with someone far longer than we expect. And perhaps the most surprising part is this: the people who change us the most often never know it. They continue living their lives, unaware that something they said or did has remained with someone else for years. They do not see the ripple effect of their actions. They do not realize the quiet impact they have made. But that does not make it any less real. If anything, it makes it more meaningful because it reminds us that impact does not always come from intention. Sometimes it comes simply from authenticity, from being human, from showing up as you are without trying to be extraordinary. And perhaps that is the most comforting realization of all. You do not need to do something big to matter. You do not need to change the world to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is a small moment, a quiet gesture, a simple presence, because you never know who is carrying something heavy. You never know who needs to feel seen, and you never know when a small, ordinary moment might become something someone remembers for the rest of their life. I was 19 the first time I truly felt this. It was early morning, the kind of morning that feels unfinished, as if the day has not fully decided what it wants to become yet. The sky outside was pale and cold, a quiet gray stretching across the horizon, and the world seemed distant in a way I could not quite explain. I was sitting on a crowded train, traveling alone for the first time, surrounded by strangers whose lives were moving in directions I would never fully know. The rhythm of the train was steady, almost hypnotic, carrying us forward while each person remained quietly inside their own thoughts. But my mind was not quiet the night before. I had argued with someone I cared deeply about. It was not a dramatic argument, not the kind that ends relationships or changes everything in an obvious way, but it was enough to leave something unresolved, enough to create a lingering weight that followed me into the next day. The words we had exchanged stayed with me, repeating themselves over and over in my mind. as if they were searching for a different ending. I replayed the conversation again and again, thinking about what I said, what they said, what I could have said differently, and what I should have understood. The more I thought about it, the heavier it felt. The weight was not just in the words themselves, but in everything that had not been said. In the silence that remained after the conversation ended, I tried not to cry. Not there, not in that space, not surrounded by people who did not know me and would never know me. I kept my eyes fixed on the window, watching the world move past in blurred lines of buildings and streets. I focused on small details, the way the pale morning light touched the glass, the reflections of unfamiliar faces layered over my own, the steady motion of everything outside as the train moved forward. I told myself to stay in control, to stay composed, to stay quiet. But sometimes, emotions do not wait for permission. They arrive anyway, and no matter how carefully you try to hold them back, they find their way through. A woman sat across from me. I had noticed her when I first took my seat, but only briefly. She looked to be in her 60s, dressed simply, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested she was familiar with moments like this. Quiet travel, quiet observation, quiet presence. There was nothing about her that demanded attention. In a crowded train, she was the kind of person you might easily overlook. And yet, there was something about her presence. It was calm, not distant, not disconnected, but steady, grounded in a way that felt undisturbed by the movement around her. She did not stare or watch me in a way that made me uncomfortable. She did not ask questions or interrupt the silence. And yet, somehow, she noticed. I could not say exactly how I knew. Maybe it was the way her gaze softened slightly when she looked up. Maybe it was a subtle change in her expression, the kind that appears when someone recognizes something familiar in another person. Or maybe it was something even quieter than that, something felt rather than seen. Without saying a word, she reached into her bag. The movement was slow and unhurried, almost gentle in its intention. She took out a small packet of tissues, held it for a brief moment, and then leaned forward slightly, placing it on the edge of my seat, not directly into my hands, not in a way that would draw attention, just close enough for me to take it if I needed to. Then she gave a soft nod. It was not demanding, not intrusive, just understanding. No words, just presence. And something inside me broke open. It was not the argument that caused the tears, not really. That had already been sitting inside me for hours, waiting quietly beneath the surface. But this moment, this small and unexpected act, was what allowed everything to finally rise. My tears came suddenly, before I could stop them, and what surprised me most was not that I was crying, but why I was crying. It was not only the pain I had been carrying, it was the kindness, the unexpected recognition, the feeling of being seen without being exposed. She did not ask me what was wrong. She did not expect an explanation. She did not try to fix anything, and because of that, I did not feel the need to hide. I took the tissues slowly, almost carefully, as if the moment itself was something fragile. I wiped my eyes, trying to regain some sense of composure. But something inside me had already shifted. For the first time that morning, I felt a small sense of relief, not because the problem had been solved, but because I was no longer carrying it alone, even if only for a moment, even if only in silence. I looked up briefly, just long enough to meet her eyes. There was no conversation, no exchange of words, but something passed between us in that glance. A quiet acknowledgement, a shared understanding that did not need to be explained. Then she looked away, returning to her own quiet space, allowing me to return to mine. The train continued moving. The world outside remained unchanged. The people around us stayed unaware of what had just happened, and yet, for me, something had changed. That moment stayed with me, not just for the rest of that day, but for years after. I never saw her again. I do not know her name, where she was going, or where she came from. To her, it may have been nothing more than a small, natural gesture, something simple, something forgettable. But to me, it was something else entirely, because she taught me something I had never fully understood before. Kindness does not need permission. It does not need to be announced. It does not need to be large or impressive to matter. Sometimes it exists in the smallest actions, in quiet moments, in the simple decision to notice someone else without making them feel exposed. And sometimes the smallest gesture can reach the deepest part of someone's heart, long after the train ride ended, long after the argument faded, long after that day became just another memory. That moment remained because it reminded me of something simple but powerful. You never truly know what someone else is carrying, and you never truly know how much a small act of kindness might mean to them. Years later, in university, another quiet moment shaped me differently. By that time in my life, I had already begun to understand that not all meaningful experiences arrive with intensity or drama. Some of them come quietly, almost unnoticed, and only reveal their importance much later. Still, I had not yet fully understood how deeply a few simple words could change the way I saw myself. I had a professor who saw something in me that I had never recognized in myself. He was not the kind of teacher who tried to impress students with authority or complexity. Instead, he spoke calmly, listened carefully, and paid attention to details that others often missed. At the time, I respected him, but I did not realize how much of an impact he would have on me. During discussions in class, I spoke less than others. In a room filled with voices eager to be heard, I often chose silence. I listened more than I spoke, I observed. I paid attention not only to what people said, but how they said it, the tone of their voice, the moments of hesitation, the small pauses that revealed uncertainty or emotion. I noticed things that were not always obvious, things that seemed to exist beneath the surface of conversation. But for a long time, I believed this was a weakness. I thought I should be more confident, more expressive, more visible. I compared myself to others who spoke easily, who seemed comfortable sharing their thoughts without hesitation. I assumed that their way of participating was the correct way, and that my quiet nature was something I needed to change. So, at times, I tried to speak more, but it never felt natural. It felt forced, as if I was trying to become someone else, instead of understanding who I already was. And because of that, I often returned to silence, but now with a quiet sense of doubt about myself, wondering whether I was falling behind simply because I was not like everyone else. One day, after class, as I was gathering my things and preparing to leave, the professor called my name. It was unexpected. I paused, slightly unsure, and turned back toward him. By then, the classroom had mostly emptied. and the noise of conversation had faded into a quiet background. He looked at me for a moment, not in a critical way, but in a thoughtful one. "You hear what people mean," he said, "not just what they say." I didn't know how to respond. The sentence was simple, but it felt unfamiliar, as if he had just described something I had never considered about myself. "That's rare," he continued, "and it will take you further than you think." There was no long explanation, no detailed advice, just those few words. I nodded slightly, unsure of what else to do, and left the classroom. But as I walked away, something inside me felt different. At first, I tried to understand what he meant. I repeated the sentence in my mind again and again. "You hear what people mean, not just what they say." Slowly, I began to see it. I thought about all those moments when I had noticed things others overlooked, the subtle emotions behind someone's words, the slight changes in tone that revealed uncertainty, the meaning hidden beneath what was actually spoken. I had always experienced these things, but I had never given them value. I had seen them as unnecessary details or even distractions. But now, for the first time, I saw them differently. It was a simple sentence, but it changed something inside me for the first time. I began to see my quiet nature, not as something I needed to fix, but as something that held value, something meaningful, something worth keeping. It did not mean I suddenly became confident or expressive in the way I once thought I should be. But it changed the way I understood myself. It replaced doubt with a quiet kind of acceptance. And over time, that acceptance became a form of strength. He probably forgot that conversation. To him, it may have been just another small moment, another simple observation shared with a student. But I didn't forget. Because sometimes a single sentence becomes a foundation you stand on for years. It becomes something you return to when you begin to doubt yourself again. It becomes a reminder of a truth you might otherwise forget. And then there was a friend, not someone who stayed in my life for long, not someone whose presence was constant or permanent, but someone who changed the way I understand listening. We met during a time when I was carrying something heavy. It was not a single problem, but a collection of thoughts and emotions that had been building quietly over months. I had not spoken about them fully to anyone. I had kept them to myself, unsure of how to express them, unsure of whether they even made sense. One evening, without planning to, I began to talk. At first, the words came slowly. I hesitated. I searched for the right way to explain what I was feeling. I expected interruptions, questions, and suggestions. I expected the usual patterns of conversation, where people respond quickly or try to offer solutions before fully understanding. But instead, something different happened. He listened fully, without interruption, without distraction, without checking his phone or looking away. He did not try to guide the conversation in a different direction. He was simply there, present in a way that felt rare. At first, it felt unusual. I wasn't used to that kind of listening. I was used to conversations where silence was quickly filled, where advice appeared too soon, and where understanding was often incomplete. But this was different. The more he listened, the more I spoke. And the more I spoke, the more I began to understand what I was actually feeling. It was as if his silence created space for my thoughts to become clearer. By the time I finished, something inside me had shifted, not because the situation had changed, but because I had finally allowed myself to express it. There was a brief moment of silence after I stopped speaking, and then he said something I had never heard before. "That sounds heavy. Thank you for trusting me with it." That was all. No solution, no judgment, no attempt to fix anything, just understanding. And in that moment, I realized something important. Being heard is sometimes more powerful than being helped, because when someone truly listens, without trying to change your experience, without trying to correct it or simplify it, something happens. You feel seen, you feel understood, you feel less alone, and sometimes that is enough. That moment stayed with me, just like the conversation with my professor. Not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed something simple and true. That connection is not always about what we say. Sometimes it is about how we listen. And sometimes the greatest gift we can offer someone is not advice, but presence. There was also a child I met while volunteering during a time when I believed I was there to give something: time, attention, support, perhaps even guidance. I thought I would be the one offering help, the one providing something meaningful to someone younger, someone still learning how to move through the world. But what I did not expect was that, in such a short and quiet encounter, I would receive something far more valuable than anything I could give. Although our time together was brief, he taught me something I had forgotten as I grew older. He was not the kind of child who demanded attention. He did not speak loudly or try to stand out. Instead, he was quiet in a way that felt natural, not withdrawn, but observant. He watched things carefully. He listened more than he spoke. There was a calmness in him that felt unusual, almost out of place in a world that often encourages children to be expressive and energetic. But what stood out most was his honesty. It was not the kind of honesty that comes from trying to impress or prove something, but a simple, direct honesty that did not need explanation. One day, while we were sitting together, I asked him a question that adults often ask without thinking too deeply about it. I asked, "Are you okay?" It was a simple question, one that usually receives a simple answer. Most people would say, "I'm fine," or "I'm okay," or "Nothing's wrong." But he did not respond that way. He looked at me without hesitation and said simply, "I'm sad today, but it will pass." There was no pause, no uncertainty, no attempt to hide or soften what he was feeling. There was only truth. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. His words were simple, but they carried a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar. There was no confusion in his voice, no struggle to explain, no effort to make his answer more acceptable or easier to hear. He was sad, and he knew it would pass. That was all. No overthinking, no resistance, no fear of being judged. Just acceptance. I remember sitting there, not knowing how to respond at first. Not because I didn't understand what he meant, but because I suddenly became aware of how different my own relationship with emotions had become. As adults, we rarely speak like that. We analyze our emotions. We question them. We try to understand where they come from, what they mean, and whether they are valid or reasonable. We hide them when they feel inconvenient. We avoid them when they feel too heavy. And sometimes we deny them completely, pretending they are not there. We complicate something that at its core is simple. But children feel, and then they allow the feeling to move through them. They do not always hold onto it. They do not always try to control it. They experience it honestly and directly, and then, in time, they let it go. That child reminded me of something I had forgotten, that honesty does not need to be complicated, that emotions do not always need to be solved, and that sometimes it is enough to simply acknowledge what you feel without trying to change it immediately. I'm sad today, but it will pass. There was something peaceful in that sentence, not because it removed the sadness, but because it accepted it. And in that acceptance, there was no struggle. That moment stayed with me, just like the others. And as time passed, I began to see a pattern. None of these people had tried to change my life. The woman on the train, the professor, the friend, and the child, none of them planned it. None of them intended to leave a lasting impact. And none of them even knew they had done anything significant. But they did something far more important. They showed up with presence, with kindness, and with humanity. And sometimes that is enough. Enough to shift something inside someone. Enough to change the way they see themselves. Enough to offer a new perspective, a new understanding, a new way of experiencing the world. Enough to leave a mark that lasts for years. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't understand then. Impact is not always loud. It does not always come from big actions or important moments, and it does not always announce itself in a way that demands attention. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a candle in a dark room, not knowing how much light it gives. And perhaps that is what makes it so powerful, because it is not forced. It is not intentional. It is simply real. Now, when I move through my own life, I carry that understanding with me, not perfectly, not always, but more than I did before. I try to listen more, not just to words, but to what exists beneath them. I try to speak gently, not because I am afraid of being heard, but because I understand that words can stay with someone longer than we realize. I try to be present, even in small moments, because I know now that small moments are not as small as they seem. They are where connection happens. They are where understanding begins. They are where something meaningful can quietly take place. And I have learned something simple but powerful. You may never know the impact you have on someone. You may never see the result of your kindness. You may never hear the story of how something you said or did stayed with someone for years. But that does not mean it isn't there, because sometimes the smallest moment becomes the one someone remembers forever. And sometimes, without even knowing it, you become part of someone else's story. Before we end this story, I want you to pause for just a moment and think about someone, not someone famous, not someone who changed your life in a big, obvious way, but Somio Nisquiet, someone who appeared in your life briefly and somehow stayed in your memory. Maybe it was a small kindness, a simple sentence, or just the feeling that, for a moment, you were seen. Now, think about this. What if, have you been that person for someone else? Without knowing it, without trying, just by being present, the way you speak, the way you listen, the way you show up in small moments. It matters more than you think. You may never hear the story. You may never see the impact, but somewhere in someone's life, a small moment with you might still be living quietly. So, as you move forward, you don't need to do something big to make a difference. Just be kind. Be present. Be human, because sometimes That is enough. And if you'd like to continue learning English through calm and meaningful stories like this one, you can stay here. There is another story waiting for you.